For IELTS Writing Task 1, there are 4 objectives that you must hit if you want 8+ band. Task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy. If you miss any of this, yeah, you're not getting 8+. See, about 70% of candidates do not really understand what these mean. What you do not understand, you can't really achieve, right? So, in this video, my aim is to foster your understanding of these things, to help you understand what good writing looks like. We'll look at some examples, we'll analyze those, and finally sharpen your understanding of a good IELTS Writing Task 1 answer. So without further ado, let's get started. So for Writing Task 1, there are about 29 themes that they might ask you a question out of, and these could be anything between economy, age and gender, manufacturing, education, could be science and technology, themes like that. And the questions could be, they'd ask you like, hey, write something about global sale of hybrid vehicles, or write about male and female workers in several employment sectors, questions like that. So that is what is, usually comprised in Writing Task 1. So in this video, what we will do is, we'll look at some examples, we'll analyze those examples. At the same time, we'll also discuss the strengths and weaknesses of these answers. And finally, we will reflect on those strengths and weaknesses and see how they apply to your answers. So before we move any further, let's quickly check your understanding. So these are 5 questions that I want you to, think about. And I want you to answer if they are true or false. So, first one, I don't have to provide an overview at the beginning of the essay. Do you think that's true or false? Well, if you thought that was false, that is right. You do need to provide an overview of your Writing Task 1 and Task 2. Question number 2, I should report both the similarities and differences I observe in the graphs. Should you? What do you think? Well, again, if you thought it was false, that is the right answer. You don't have to basically cover everything. You only cover what's worth covering. Number 3, I can write every detail I find in the graph. Is that true? False? What do you think? Well, the answer is false. You don't write every little detail. That'll just put you way over the mark and too much time being consumed. Then, I should highlight the key features in the graph. Do you think that's true or false? Well, it's false. Finally, I should support my description with data from the graph. True? False? What do you think? I'll let you decide. You know what the answer is. Okay, so when we talk about Task 1, the way you're assessed is, have you hit task achievement? So, I'm sure you must have heard 1,000 times something called task achievement. This is what task achievement looks like. First of all, you have the requirements that you need to hit. And you also have the development that you need to do for your content. So when we talk about requirements, there are 3 things that you need to do. You need to summarize the data, which you do by writing an overview. Then in the data, you have to select, you have to do something called grouping, and you have to talk about the extremes. So for grouping, that is basically finding different datas and then just grouping it all together. And for extremes, if you find something that's completely different, talk about that. And you also need to compare the data. You talk about the similarities and you talk about differences. So some things to do there as well. So when we move to content development, there are a few things that you need to consider. First of all, you have to ensure you're writing in the correct format. Because if your format is wrong, it won't get you far. Then you need to have clarity in your writing. It must be comprehensible. They need to understand what you've written. After that, it also has to be relevant. So all that you write, it has to be relevant with the data that is given to you. Don't just go about making up stories. That won't get you anywhere. Then you have to be accurate with the data. So you can't just go about saying there's 15% data that's going up. Whereas in the graph, it only shows 10%. So don't do that. That'll cause you a lot of trouble. You'll lose points. Finally, sufficiency. You have to write 150 words minimum. Anything less than that, nope, you lose points. Don't do that. So hit your minimum, make sure it's sufficient. So now you know what task achievement is about, right? Let's move further on. So let's talk about writing an overview. And when you have to do the analysis for this is how usually the overviews are graded. So, did the student indicate what the graph is about? You have to give an overview of that. Second, did the student use different wordings, or did she just copy the question? So that's number 2. And finally, number 3 is, did the student summarize the graph in a succinct manner? Now I'm going to show you a couple of overviews and we'll analyze those. So let's look at question number 1. So take a couple minutes, look at this question, look at the data that's being presented here. I'll give you a couple minutes on that. Alright, now let's look at example number 1. Referring to the graph, it shows the number of academic jobs in some humanities and social sciences disciplines from 2012 to 2014. So now, let's look at a quick analysis of this overview, if what's being presented here does make sense. So, with this overview, first of all, let's see, did the student indicate what the graph is about? Yes, they did. How? So see how they talked about the student indicated the topic of the graph and the period concerned. So they talk about the period concerned. Graph shows number of academic and jobs in some humanities and social sciences. So it covers that. Now, did the student use different wordings, or did she simply copy the question? So yeah, the student did change the wordings. The student started the overview with the referring to the graph. Then they replaced gives information with shows, replaced between and with from to. So some words you might want to use here that you can write these down. So you can use them in your answers. And finally, did the student summarize the graph in a succinct manner? No, they did not. So that's a problem there. Now let's look at next example. The graph below gives information about the number of academic jobs in some humanities and social sciences disciplines between 2012 and 2014. Let's look at the analysis for this answer. So, did the student indicate what the graph is about? Yes, they did. They spoke about what the graph is about. Now, did the student use different wording, or did she simply copy the question? Nope, they simply copied the question. So, what is this? It's bad. That's a bad answer. Don't do that. Don't just copy stuff. You'll lose points. Finally, did the student summarize the graph in a succinct manner? No, they did not. They lose points again. So, it's a bad answer. Now let's look at the example number 3. Referring to the graph, it shows the numbers of academic jobs available in some humanities and social sciences disciplines from 2012 to 2014. Generally speaking, most jobs were available for graduates in the English discipline. So, let's quickly analyze this one. So, did the student indicate what the graph is about? Yep, they did. They spoke about the period concerned, they spoke about the main topic of it. Now, did the student use different wordings, or did she simply just copy stuff? Nope, they used different wordings. So this is how they, changed words there. So they started over with the referring to the graph, that's how they started out. Then they replaced gives information with shows, and they replaced between and with from to. So just look at how this was done and compare that to the question. Finally, did the student summarize the graph in a succinct manner? Yes, they did. See this last bit here? Generally speaking, most jobs were available for graduates in the English discipline. They covered it. Isn't that great? That's what you need to do with your answers. You need to make sure that you talk about what the graph is about. You use different wordings and you summarize everything. You have to do this in the overview. This is what a good overview looks like. Now, let's talk about selecting information to report. You can't just put everything in the answer. That's the wrong way to go about it. And when they check the answer, when the instructor is looking at your answers, these are the 3 things that they look at. First, did the student choose the most important and representative data points to report? That's number 1. Number 2, did the student categorize data and information into groups? Grouping, did they do that? Finally, did the student report data that represent extremes in the graph? Did you cover the extremes in the graph or not? These are 3 things that they look at. So let's look at some examples and let's see how you can write better answers. So here's the question. Give it a couple minutes, go through it, and then we'll look at example 1. Alright, example 1. To start with, the number of academic jobs in English declined gradually from 1,200 to 900 between 2012 and 2014, yet the number of English-related jobs was still the highest compared to other disciplines. Regarding subjects that showed a steady boom in the number of jobs over the 3 years, there were approximately 200 more academic jobs in the discipline of communication. Furthermore, the number of jobs in sociology escalated slowly between 2012 and 2014. Now, let's look at the quick analysis for this answer. First of all, did the student choose the most important representative data points to report? Yep, they did. See this bit where they talk about decline gradually from 1,200 between 2012 and 2014? Those are the key things, and you have to talk about that. Second, did the student categorize data and information into groups? Yep, they did. So they basically created a group regarding subjects that showed a steady boom in the amount of jobs over the 3 years. So they grouped that. Finally, did the student report data that represent the extremes in the graph? Yep, they reported the extremes. Yet English still managed to have the highest number of jobs compared to other disciplines. So they talk about the key extremes as well, right? So this is how you go about picking data. Let's look at one more example here. To start with, the number of academic jobs in English declined gradually from 1,200 in 2012 to 1,000 in 2013, and from 1,000 in 2013 to 900 in 2014. Yet the number of English-related jobs was still the highest compared to other disciplines. On the other hand, communications was one of the two subjects that has shown a steady boom in the number of jobs over 3 years. Furthermore, the number of jobs in sociology escalated slowly between 2012 and 2014. Let's look at the analysis for this. First of all, the student didn't choose the most important representative data points to report. What did they pick? The number of academic jobs in English declined gradually from 1,200 in 2012 to 1,000 in 2013, and then it just goes on into like a bunch of other numbers, which is very hard to understand. Don't write like that. Number 2, yeah, the student did categorize the data and information in groups. So, they spoke about communication, that was a group, and the two subjects that shown a steady boom in amount of jobs over 3 years. So there was some classification there, some grouping. Finally, did the student report data that represent extremes in the graph? Yep, they did cover the extremes. They spoke about how English, still managed to have the highest number of jobs, so that was covered. But still not a good answer. It's kind of hard to understand, so remember that. Next, let's look at comparing data. So when you have to compare data, there are two things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, you have to highlight similar features between data points. Then you have to highlight contrastive features between data points. Let's look at an example. So look at this question, go through it, and then we'll look at some examples and analyze those. So here's an example 1. To begin with, phones occupy the largest distribution of total sales among the 6 products in the company, with more than half of the total sales. Specifically, the sale of phones was almost 3 times of that of tablets and approximately 5 times more than that of computers. On the other hand, the percentage of sales of music players and accessories were almost identical. Now let's quickly analyze this. First of all, the student did highlight similar features between data points. See where they spoke about, on the other hand, the percentage of sales of music players and accessories were almost identical. That's how they did it. Then, they did cover, the contrastive features. The student used their superlative, the largest, to contrast the distribution of phone sales with other sales. So some things, to keep in mind. So this is how they went about comparing the data. Now let's look at example 2. To begin with, phones occupy the largest distribution of sales among the 6 products in the company, with more than half of the total sales. Yeah, this is not a great answer. They did not cover any similarities, they did not cover anything, that is being contrasted. So really, it's just a no, it's a bad answer, don't do that. Cover things, talk about the details. Now we'll cover the format. Now let's look at this. With format, there are 3 things to keep in mind. you have to write in paragraphs and you have to complete sentences. Then you have to include a short introductory paragraph, which is called an overview, then 1 or 2 body paragraphs, and an optional concluding paragraph. So here's a question. I'll give you a couple minutes, go through it. Okay, let's look at example 1. The pie chart indicates the distribution of online sales for 4 types of ebooks in country A between 2008 and 18. In 2008, all ebooks, including biography, children's book, fiction, and cookbook, occupied more than 1/5 of the sales in country A. In 2018, children's book dominated the 4 ebook types with nearly 2/5 of the share. On the other hand, biography had the largest drop in the distribution of sales from 1/5 to less than 1/10. Besides, the distribution of sales for cookbook remained unchanged to 28%, while fiction showed a slight decline in the distribution of online sales compared to that in 2008. The ebook sales distributed more evenly in 2008 compared with that in 2018. Moreover, children's book was the only ebook type that demonstrated a great distribution of sales in the decade. To conclude, there is a prediction that the distribution of sales for children's book would become bigger, and this book type would be dominant in the feature-use children's book are essential for every family. I know it's a mouthful. Let's quickly look at what this answer looks like. Let's analyze this. So, as you can see, it was written in like paragraphs, because look at this, they broke it down into paragraphs. There's an overview, there's a paragraph, another paragraph, and a conclusion there. So it was well paragraphed. Then the student did include a short introductory paragraph, 1 or 2 bodies, and an optional concluding paragraph. Yes, so they did cover most of the things there. So that's how you go about formatting your answers. Now let's talk about clarity, relevance, accuracy, and sufficiency. So these are some things that you need to cover in your answers. Your answers need to be clear, relevant, accurate, and sufficient. 4 things that you have to keep in mind here. First of all, you have to use not only the verbs, but also adverbs and adjectives to denote the extent of change. Second, you have to present the data that's given in the graph and not include explanations. You don't have to give explanations, just talk about the data. Third, you have to include specific numbers to support your hypothesis that you've summed up from the data. So give support for your answers. And finally, you have to report on the majority of data points or information presented in the graph. So keep that in mind. Okay, now let's look at an example. This is off of the same pie chart that you saw a couple minutes back. So look at this answer. The pie chart indicates the distribution of online sales for 4 types of ebooks in country A between 2008 and 2018. In 2008, all retail sectors including biography, children's book, fiction, and cookbook occupied more than 1/5 of the sales in country. In 2018, children's book dominated the 4 ebooks types. On the other hand, biography dropped in its distribution of sales. Besides, the distribution of sales for cookbook remained unchanged, while fiction showed a decline in the distribution of sales compared to that in 2008. The sales for ebooks distributed more evenly in 2008 compared with that in 2018. Moreover, children's book was the only ebook type that demonstrated great distribution of sales in the decade. Now let's quickly analyze this. Overall, it's an okay answer because first of all, they did use, different adjectives and adverbs to basically go over their answer. So you see how they used like the sales for ebooks distributed more evenly in 2008, things like that. One instance, but it was still done. Second, did the student report data that are presented in the graph or table and not include explanations of the data? Yes, they did. There were no predictions or interpretations given here, so make sure you don't do that. You do not go about giving explanations because that's just wrong. Number 3, did the student include specific numbers to support his or data description? No, they did not. They didn't talk about any percentages, they didn't talk about any numbers, so that's where the answer is, not good. You have to cover those things. Finally, did the student report the majority of the data points or information presented in the graph? Did they do that? Yep, they covered those data points. So these are some things that you have to keep in mind when you talk about clarity, accuracy, and sufficiency. So there you go. That's pretty much, it sums it up, what task achievement is all about, what you need to decide when you have to, give your answers, how you can hit the requirements by summarizing the data and then selecting and grouping them into extremes, and then finally comparing the data. Also at the same time, you learned how to format, your report, how to write for clarity, keeping things relevant, and finally making things accurate and sufficient. So, I know this was quite a bit of information to intake, so go over this video a couple of times, go through these examples, and start analyzing your answers in such a way as well. This will really help you decide if you're, writing well or not. Hope you liked this video, hope you learned something new, and hey, you know what? If you like this video, share it with someone who might be struggling with any of this. This will help them out. And of course, subscribe if you like this. There's more information coming like that, so keep an eye out for it. Take care. See you in the next video.